Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to On Trial, starring Mark Radulich, also starring Sean Comer. Hope you're ready, Hollywood, because you're on trial.
All rise. Court is in session. The Honorable Judge Fudge is presiding, and I am your host, the mandated reporter, and frankly, I'm mortified, Mr. Mark Radulich. Tonight, I take the role of the defense as we put the Amazing Spider-Man 2, brought to you by the good folks at Sony, you know, those competent people, on trial. Joining me tonight, as he does each and every on trial, this time in the chair of the prosecution, my co-host, the inimitable Mr. Sean Comer. How do you do, sir?
Alice Cabot for the prosecution, your fudginess.
So, you may be asking yourself, hey, didn't you already cover this once before? And as I've said with every plug of this thing, yes, we did review The Amazing Spider-Man 2. It was in the early stages of what is now known as Damn You Hollywood, hosted by Robert Winfrey, co-hosted by myself. We had Pat Mullen on that show, and that show was a lot of me and Pat yelling at one another and Robert Winfrey trying to, step in between us and settle us down. So it's this is going to be one of those rare opportunities where I get a do-over. Like X-Men 3 or some of the other movies that on Long Road to Ruin, just because of time, I never got a good opportunity to lay down a proper defense of. This is one of those movies where I'm fairly passionate about the idea that it's not as bad as it's been made out to be, and this is the format for me to present my case without Pat Mullen yelling at me, or without anyone yelling at me for that matter. But before we get to that, let's go ahead and give the floor to Sean so that he can give us some notes here on The Amazing Spider-Man 2, brought to you by the good people at Sony. And then we'll get to the plot synopsis, and then we will start the trial. Sean?
Thank you, Your Highness. Well, Sony has now had two starts and stops with the Spider-Man franchise. The first came after they decided to hit the reset button after Spider-Man 1 was one of two movies, the other being 2000's X-Men, that absolutely revolutionized comic book movies as we know them today. Spider-Man 2, much like X-Men 2, or X2, X-Men United, came right out of the gates and further did gangbusters business and was regarded as being even superior to its predecessor. Then along came Spider-Man 3, and oh, sweet peanut buttery fuck. Spider-Man 3, what happened to you? What did they do to you, you poor sweet baby? It did decent box office. It made all right money, but it was overall looked upon as being an overstuffed, campy laughingstock, which has a habit of killing comic movies when you get slapped with that label. And so, with Sam Raimi not really wanting to return, and with Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst both saying, no, we don't really want to be back if Sam's not going to be back, Sony just decided to nuke that site from orbit. It was the only way to be sure, and they just started over with an entirely new franchise. This one retitled The Amazing Spider-Man, given some notable tonal shifts, entirely recast, set completely apart from the first three movies. first movie, it had its issues, and it did great business at the box office, was received mostly favorably, at the very least well enough that Sony decided, okay, that's a good start. We're going to go ahead with the sequel. And that they did, and what we got was the Amazing Spider-Man 2, which itself went through a few revisions during its process, the most notable of which being the fact that this movie was once going to introduce Mary Jane Watson. In fact, Shailene Woodley had shot a number of her scenes. I think all but one or two were actually in the can. This is me kind of calling out to our resident Radulich and Broadcasting Network Spider-Man expert Ben Colon, and also to Jesse Starcher or anyone else who wants to throw in their 2 cents if I'm wrong. But for what seemed like various fairly ambiguous reasons, she was cut entirely, which she was able to do because it's still pretty much the Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy story. The big place where it fell through, as we're going to discuss at much greater length, was the fact that Sony was already putting a lot of eggs in this basket. They had planned to go forward with 2 more proper Amazing Spider-Man sequels and multiple spin-offs. Most notably, this was, and it's very clear upon watching it, it was meant to be kind of a soft preview, in a way, of what was then the upcoming Sinister Six movie, which was going to be a kind of precedent setter. It was going to be, I believe, the first major studio-backed comic movie that was going to focus pretty much entirely on villains. Not on heroes, but just the coming together of a squad of bad guys. And again, we're going to get into that in much, much greater depth. But they were trying to set up the Spider-Man sequels. They were trying to set up the Sinister Six. And it all came together into a giant, explosive, bloated, 20 minutes too long clusterfuck. It was well cast, featuring the likes of Paul Giamatti, Andrew Garfield, Emma Stone, Jamie Foxx, Dane DeHaan was in it too. I hesitate to call him a good casting decision. But it seemed to have all the right DNA, and it didn't even do too badly at the box office, really, either. On a budget of $293 million, it did $709 million. So it's hard to call it entirely a failure, but it still generated enough negative buzz among critics and fans that after it came out, Sony once more decided, okay, back to the drawing board, done. We're just shit canning this and all of our plans related to it right now. There really aren't a whole lot of interesting production notes to go along with it. The most interesting one that I found, and it just sounds ill-fated from the start, but after Amazing Spider-Man 2's London premiere, Sony added a mid-credit teaser scene. However, it was not a Spider-Man related scene. It was actually, per an agreement between themselves and 20th Century Fox, a teaser for X-Men Days of Future Past. Basically, the agreement was Fox would give the okay for director Mark Webb, who was under contract to them, to briefly set up shop over at Sony to direct Amazing Spider-Man 2, but they would only go along with it if Sony would be cool with giving them some free promotion for the next X-Men movie. If you want to go look it up, according to Wikipedia, and I quote, "The scene set during the Vietnam War shows Mystique, a rogue mutant, trying to infiltrate a military camp led by William Stryker in an attempt to rescue fellow mutants Havoc and Toad." This backfired in a way because it sort of led some people to believe that there was a Spider-Man X-Men crossover that was going to be on the way in the very near future, because they were conditioned by Disney and Marvel attaching multiple codas to each of their Marvel Cinematic Universe movies as a way of either A, just having a little fun, or B, trying to set up something for down the road. So that's really about all there is to it. Again, it's not a total failure, but its problems they're noticeable, they're severe, and they ultimately proved to be really, really costly, despite the fact that, for the most part, its reviews were actually, unless you look at the specific numerical score, they read largely positively. It's just the general consensus is holy hell, 50 pounds of shit, 5-pound bag. So, from there, Mark, how about you talk us through this rather confusing web of plot points?
Well said. All right. I'm going to do a very, very brief synopsis here because one could get bogged down in the details very quickly with this. But we open with sort of a flashback scene of Richard Parker trying to upload his video and information to a secret base lab that he has in an abandoned subway. This is aboard a plane. Him and his wife are trying to escape town because they are going into hiding from Oscorp. They're both killed, but the video makes it where it's supposed to go. We then get to present day. There's this opening sequence of Paul Giamatti driving a truck through Manhattan, and when I say through Manhattan, I really mean through Manhattan. Like, he's just destroying buildings and cars and all kinds of bric-a-brac. And we have a big giant epic action sequence where Spider-Man foils this attempt to steal chemicals. We move to the graduation sequence where Gwen Stacy delivers the address. He gets there in the ta-da nick of time. He misses the speech, but he gets there to pick up his diploma. I should say during the sequence with Paul Giamatti, he also saves the life of the Jamie Foxx character, whose name is Max Dillon, which becomes important later on. Anyway, back to that. There's a long series of sequences where Peter is still wrestling with the guilt of Gwen Stacy's dad saying, "Don't date my daughter, you're going to get her killed." That's foreshadowing. And his desire to still be with her despite all of that. They subsequently break up, and they make up, and they're friends, and there's all kinds of kissy-kissy going on. We also are introduced to Harry Osborn. Harry Osborn has a scene with his dad, Norman Osborn, who proceeds to die from some kind of crazy disease that Harry finds out that he also has. Along the way, Harry figures out that he needs Spider-Man's blood in order to cure himself of this, and Spider-Man says, "Yeah, that sounds like a terrible idea," and refuses. Along the way, Max falls into a vat of genetically engineered electric eels who all attack him. and turned him into, quote-unquote, a living electric generator. He stumbles into the streets of Manhattan, and he ends up getting into a fight with Spider-Man. The Spider, they fight, and eventually he is summarily defeated for the time being and ends up being locked away. Later on in the movie, after Spider-Man refuses Harry Osborn, Harry makes a deal with the captured Electro. He sets him free. I believe Harry ends up using the chemicals on himself, which cures the disease, but then turns him into an evil elf. He then grabs Norman, this equipment, this armor that Norman created, and turns into the Green Goblin. There's a second huge fight between Electro and Spider-Man. Gwen and Spider-Man figure out how to do away with him, which they do. But just as they do away with Electro, the Green Goblin shows up. He figures out that Peter is Spider-Man. Spider-Man is Peter. He grabs Gwen, proceeds to chuck her down with some sort of structure. The Spider-Man attempts to save her, and in doing so breaks her back. He defeats Harry. We get a panning shot of all these different other kinds of armor, such as the Vulture and the Dr. Octopus and the Rhino, because we're setting up for the Sinister Six, you see. There's a sequence where Peter stops being Spider-Man, but at the end he is convinced to go back out there and do what's right. Paul Giamatti dons the Rhino armor. They begin to have a fight, and the movie ends. So that's the basic points. I mean, I know I skipped the whole subplot of Gwen Stacy going to England, but it just doesn't matter at this point. Those are the big plot points in the movie. Sean, you're a witness.
Thank you, Your Judginess. You know, what this movie is really guilty of more than anything else is not necessarily being bad to the bone. It was not born bad. It's, if anything, I would dare say that its greatest crime is that it wastes some truly special things that it had going on. And it wastes them by Sony's refusal to learn from their mistakes. For some reason, Sony just refused to acknowledge, after the original trilogy of Spider-Man movies, that where the biggest place where Spider-Man 3 went wrong was trying to do too much in too short a time, as opposed to being more strictly focused on just, say, two major threads. In the first Spider-Man, it was the notion of how the onset of Peter's powers change him, and then you have the looming threat of Norman Osborn. There you have it. You have two major concurrent threads, and then you just build toward the two of them converging on the horizon. In Spider-Man 2, you have the thread of Peter's powers and trying to balance being Peter Parker and being Spider-Man are seemingly ruining his life, forcing him into great personal sacrifice, just making him miserable, and then all of a sudden the powers are gone. And then, on the other hand, you have the rather tragic rise of Dr. Octopus. And again, by the end of the movie, those threads, in all their various, molecules and particles that flow along them, they converge on the horizon. Spider-Man 3 comes along, and oh, great and powerful, holy gazoo, fuck. All of a sudden, we have the culmination of the Harry Osborn and Peter saga, which includes Harry's amnesia. You have Peter getting too big for his britches and needing to be smacked down by life, and that comes along with it. Him being seemingly kind of sort of torn between Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane, and you have the black suit that's affecting him the entire way beneath the surface as his frustrations continue to once more mount. You have the rise of the Sandman. You have that half-assed version of the symbiote saga, and there's Harry and Mary Jane, and holy shit, Kirsten Dunst cannot dance to save her life, and sweet fuck, these two really can't make an omelet. And then there's Peter, and there's disco dancing, and then there's My Chemical Romance hair, and then there's the whole thing where, surprise, everything we set up in the first movie about how Uncle Ben died, it's bullshit, because despite what we showed, this is really what happened, because reasons. And then there's another musical number in a jazz club, and there's, Topher Grace absolutely murdering any hopes I ever had up to that point of Venom being cool. And all of this gets crammed into about a 2-hour movie. And you would think that would have taught them something, because actually the first Amazing Spider-Man really brought it back to its roots. It brought it back to a fairly narrow story, albeit they went back to the well and did the origin story again, but we can talk about that another time. That's really neither here nor there, except to point out that it was focused. For all the problems the first movie had, and it did have its problems, it was focused on just a couple of major threads and then tying them together at the end. This movie, okay, we have Peter's quest for the truth about his parents. We have his failing relationship with Gwen Stacy. We have the tragic origins of Max Dillon. We have the tragedy that Dane DeHaan can't act his way out of a paper bag, and I'm supposed to buy him as a threatening villain to Spider-Man. We have me wondering, if you're going to do that, why don't you just do Norman Osborn? He's the greatest Green Goblin. Why you do this? We have, and again, I'm getting away with just my little petty criticisms here, but you have all of this and everything that you're having to ping pong back and forth between and to balance and to tie together, and you're trying to use about 2.5 hours to do it, whereas if you had cut most of this extraneous shit, you would have a perfectly fine, right around 2-hour movie. Had you just chosen, okay, either A, we're going to do Spider-Man versus Electro, or B, we're going to introduce the Green Goblin, albeit the wrong Green Goblin. And we're going to do that so that we can build up to properly carrying off the death of Gwen Stacy at the end of this movie. And in the midst of that, somehow, you actually have a lot of good things going on. Most notably, I'll give Andrew Garfield credit where it's due. I will tip my hat justly to him. He improved greatly as both Spider-Man and Peter Parker between the two movies. He did a fine job throughout the movie working with what he was given. This is one of the few times that Jamie Foxx has ever been fully bearable in a leading role. there were more than glimmers of actual effort. There was a lot of actual effort going on there. He was a surprisingly strong villain who was wisely designed after the Ultimate Spider-Man version of Electro, so the classic one, and might I say, looked fantastic. Well done. Another example of the superb special effects the whole way around. Emma Stone was, in both movies, an absolute treat as Gwen Stacy. I'm not the type who will almost ever go to see a movie just because someone happens to be in it, but that's one time where I would make an exception, because Sony every bit got their money's worth out of her. And you've got all this. You've got these scattered good things there. Oh, and lest I forget, Sally Field, tremendous choice to play Aunt May. Just absolutely wonderful. But the problem is it doesn't coalesce into a cohesive, consistent movie. It's a jarring whiplash from one story to the next, where hardly anything ever feels like it's given the due time that we want it to have. And it gets ahead of itself, as many movies in the past have, by trying to set up for projects that weren't even on the drawing board. And granted, they were promising. I like the idea of a Sinister Six movie. I would actually be completely down for that. I would love it if they would do that and do it well and do it in the right way. I would love it if they would do additional spin-offs. Like I'm really hoping that Venom turns out to possibly be as good as it sounds like it kind of sort of might be able to be, so that we can get an extended Spider-Verse movie like we've had an extended X-Men universe, an extended Marvel universe. But this makes seemingly the entire movie just an excuse to build those up. Now, since so many of us are wrestling fans here, I'm going to go ahead and make a professional wrestling comparison. That's like the notion under which WCW used to operate, in which the whole idea of having big $40, $50 pay-per-view events was to get people to tune in to the free cable shows on TBS and TNT. It's absolutely backwards. It gets the cart in front of the horse, rather than focusing, building up, and really earning the right to move those projects forward by taking things one step at a time and advancing things just a little bit slowly with just a few teases. Instead, what we get is a movie that would almost rather not be there and would rather just kind of be the Sinister Six already. It would rather just be the next spinoff. And so, Sony, I hate to say it, but if nothing else, yes, you are absolutely 100% guilty of missing your opportunity to learn from your mistakes and do right by a legendary property that has struggled for a good 3 movies now prior to Spider-Man Homecoming. Mark.
Okay. I wanted to make sure you were done. You're supposed to say you're a witness. Okay. My contention is that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is not a perfect movie by any stretch of the imagination, but it is not as guilty as people would have you believe. I've heard it's the worst movie some have ever seen. I've heard it's a train wreck. It's atrocious. It is absolutely guilty of being overstuffed. It is guilty of having a lot of plot lines that don't necessarily coalesce as smoothly as they should. But to say the thing is completely without merit is to be blind to what is obviously good about this movie. Let's talk about the elements. Let's talk about the craft. First of all, the movie, for the most part, looks gorgeous. That opening sequence after the plane born identity incident, let's put that aside. That, not so good. But the opening shot of Spider-Man diving into Manhattan and taking down Paul Giamatti is fantastic, is action-packed. It looks phenomenal. It is absolutely shot so well. I remember watching it for the first time in the theaters and immediately being drawn into the movie. As silly as some of the other aspects of it were, if you had just shown me that one scene, and then it's like, okay, well, that's the end of the movie. He took, the big villain was Paul Giamatti, and he took him out in the first scene. I actually would have been satisfied. It's that good. The acting in the movie. Jamie Foxx gets a lot of flack for his portrayal of Electro, but I would counter that with, I don't think people understand mental health. I don't think people understand how lonely, crazy people behave and what could possibly motivate them to act the way that they do. The Jamie Foxx Max Dillon character is drawn in such a way that it is absolutely believable he would become obsessed with Spider-Man, and when he felt slighted, like someone who has borderline personality disorder, that he would go crazy and use his newfound powers to try to kill him. That is absolutely believable, and I thought Jamie Foxx did a great job of portraying that kind of madness. He also looks amazing as Electro. As silly as it is for him to fall into a vat of electric eels and suddenly get electric powers, I've seen dumber. I mean, let's face it. The whole origin of Spider-Man is dumb. He was bitten by radioactive spiders, or genetically mutated spiders, or this kind of spider, or that kind of spider. I mean, at some point, you must accept the fantasy that strange things happen to people and they get wondrous powers from it. So is falling into a vat of electric eels any dumber than being bitten by an electric spider? Not an electric spider. A radioactive spider or genetically mutated spider, or my personal favorite, the pair of incidents where not one but two women were bitten by cats. Lots and lots of cats, and got cat powers from it in two different stories featuring Catwoman. So, I think we're a little too hard on the beaver when people, get all up in arms about the falling into a vat of electric eels. But I digress. I was talking about the acting. I thought Jamie Foxx did a splendid job of portraying a mad man who goes from being disenfranchised to empowered, greatly empowered. Fantastic job. So let's talk about our stars. Let's talk about Andrew Garfield and his love interest, Gwen Stacy, portrayed by Emma Stone. Universally, people have said they have great on-screen charisma. Now, I believe they were dating at the time, and I'm sure that helped, but it doesn't always, and I don't think a point should be taken away from the movie because they just so happen to be in a relationship. I don't think that's fair. They work on screen, and since at least a third of the movie is dedicated to their will they, won't they romance, I think both of them do a very, very good job. That scene where they're walking through Manhattan and they decide to be friends and they're coming up with the rules of their relationship and they're pointing out things they love about one another is adorable. It is captivating to watch on screen. and it is patently unfair to judge them to judge them harshly for what I felt was an accurate portrayal of what young love could be, especially a relationship as complicated as theirs. And why can't Peter be tormented by her father's ghost? You know, Peter Parker is nothing if not tormented by guilt of his Uncle Ben's death, guilt over, you know, any number of things that have happened. And the man flat out said to him, "You're going to get my daughter killed. Don't do it. Leave her alone." It would be absolutely reasonable for him to wrestle and struggle and be at his wit's end over whether or not he should be with this woman when she's clearly the love of his life. And I believe all of that comes out on screen. And since it's a large portion of the movie, I don't get why people had such a problem with this. I remember Pat's argument being, they made Spider-Man too emo. No, they made him a human being is what happened there. And in my recollection of the comics, that's pretty accurate. Take away all like the skateboarding and the hair and some of this more, we'll call them poochy elements of the way they've drawn Peter in this movie. If there was a consistency from the comic book to The Amazing Spider-Man 2 over him wrestling with guilt and having his life always just out of reach, out of hand, and him struggling to keep all of the balls in the air. I thought all that was accurate, and I thought that was well portrayed in this movie. Sean attacked the character, the acting ability of Dane DeHaan, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Dane DeHaan should have won an Oscar for his performance. I'm not even sure he should have won a Razzie, as it wasn't as over the top and silly enough to warrant discussion or merit. He's just there, and for the most part, he's struggling with dying. For 90% of the movie that he's in, he's just a kid in desperation. Which, in all fairness, I believe he does portray fairly well. It's not great. It's not meritorious. It's not anything to write home about. But as far as, a director saying to him, "Hey, you're dying, you're desperate, that's what we need to see come out on screen," I believe he achieves that goal well enough. And oh, by the way, again, his first scene with Peter when they're reconnecting and talking and sharing memories was a well-played scene. And it wasn't just carried by Andrew Garfield. Dane DeHaan holds up his end of that particular scene. Now, when he becomes the Green Goblin, it's a whole other story, and criticisms that are levied are probably accurate. But I'm here to defend this movie, so we're not going to talk about that end of it. The two scenes where Spider-Man battles Electro are both very well done, very well executed. We talked about in the new Spider-Man movie, Homecoming, that the final sequence where Peter takes on the Vulture, without giving away spoilers, is just black on black on black on black, and it's very hard to read, and you don't know what's going on until it all stops. Well, I don't remember having a problem with that with any of the fight scenes with Electro. This movie is nothing if not colorful. And that's an important element to watching a movie, is you want things to beam. You want to see a wide color. Unless you're doing something really artsy or whatever, you want to see a wide and vivid color palette. And this does. It is successful in that manner. Finally, let's talk about the plot. So you have Dane DeHaan, who is ill, and he wants Peter's blood. And so and that ends with him going crazy and wanting to kill Peter out of revenge because, he's become a monster. You have the Electro plot of here is a disenfranchised man who is given hope and by Spider-Man, and he is under the deluded belief that he's somehow important to Spider-Man because Spider-Man told him so. And he becomes Electro, and he gets revenge on all the people at Oscorp. And when he realizes that Spider-Man was just placating him, he wants revenge on Spider-Man too. Then you have the plot line of the will they, won't they between him and Gwen. And I want to add a caveat to that. So many of the superhero movies that come out today, the criticism is, here we have superheroes that don't save anybody. It's just destruction porn. Go back and watch The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and you will see a hero that saves lots of people. And especially in the sequences with Electro, he isn't just saving Gwen Stacy and letting Manhattan fall into the East River. In both sequences where he's fighting Electro, he's saving all kinds of passerbys. In the scene where him and Paul Giamatti tear apart Midtown via truck, he's still saving other people, including the guy that will become Electro, Max Dillon. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. This is a movie where Spider-Man is a hero who saves people, which stands apart from a lot of comic book movies these days. So anyway, that plays into the plot with him and Gwen Stacy, where you have a situation where, Spider-Man is able to save all of these people, even people who will come to betray him, people who will come to hate him and want revenge on him. But when it comes time to save his beloved, he fails. And that leads to what I think are some of the strongest sequences. This is yet another bone of contention, as I recall, between Pat and I a couple of years ago when we discussed this. He is so overwhelmed with guilt that he stops being Spider-Man for a while, which is reasonable. He couldn't save the one person on Earth he loved, who he was willing to travel to England for, who was willing to give up being Spider-Man for. And if he can't save the one you love, why are you bothering to do it at all? Is not an unreasonable conclusion to come to when you are distraught and depressed and feeling like you have no purpose anymore. And even then, he's able to pick himself up by his bootstraps and get out there and fight the good fight again. And then Paul Giamatti puts on a rhino suit and runs at him. Which, I'm sorry. I know people found that frustrating. It was like, oh, enough with the Sinister Six already and the silly, stupid rhino costume and all that. But I thought it was really funny. And I enjoyed Paul Giamatti and his over-the-top acting. I thought it added an element of fun to the film. So, is The Amazing Spider-Man perfect? No. It's a bit of an overstuffed sausage. I admit that wholeheartedly. But it is not the trash heap that everyone keeps insisting that it is. I would go as far as to say it's better than Spider-Man 3. Spider-Man 3 was also an overstuffed sausage. But some of the acting in that movie is the shits. Topher Grace is terrible as Eddie Brock / Venom. James Franco, as was discussed by even the prosecution, can't act his way out of a paper bag at times. You talk about Dane DeHaan. I don't think James Franco did a great job either, by comparison. And then, of course, even Tobey Maguire, you're Spider-Man. At least with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, you're grounded by a Peter Parker who was portrayed adequately to great by Andrew Garfield. Tobey Maguire sucked in Spider-Man 3 as Peter Parker, especially evil Peter Parker, who had been overwhelmed by the black suit. So, and then you have Kirsten Dunst, who is like negative charisma, especially compared to Emma Stone. So again, I would tell you that when ranking Spider-Man films, as much hate has been levied against Amazing Spider-Man 2, at least it's better than Spider-Man 3. The defense rests.
Oh, well then, it's better than Spider-Man 3. Oh, well then, that's an excellent point. Gee, I fold my entire case because, being punchy.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Is better.
Sorry.
Excuse me?
Go on. I said, okay, good night, everybody. I was just...
Because, of course, having Boss Rutan kick you in the liver is better than having him kick you in the dick. Oh, wait, no, it isn't. It's still fucking painful. Okay, let's talk about Dane DeHaan for a moment. Look, on the offhand chance that a live-action Tiny Toon Adventures movie ever gets made, I will wholeheartedly go in for him playing Montana Max based on his performance in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I'm fine with that. I can definitely picture him terrorizing Buster and Babs Bunny. But, that being said, while, yeah, maybe he would have made a pretty good Harry Osborn, the thing is, we're talking about the Green Goblin. He is to Spider-Man what Magneto is to the X-Men, what the Joker is to Batman, what Lex Luthor is to Superman. In the eyes of most fans of the comic, that is the quintessential Spider-Man villain. That was why in the very first movie, that was the one that Sam Raimi put, boom, right front and center. Didn't go for anybody else, didn't go for Doc Ock right away, didn't go for Sandman, although he certainly got around to him. Sam never wanted to do Venom in the first place. But that was one time when casting was everything, as it should be. Because when it comes to a role that's that important, that's that critical to the mythos of a character, you want to make sure that you're measuring twice and cutting once. When they cast Dane DeHaan to be not just Harry Osborn, but the Green fucking Goblin, I get the feeling they didn't measure at all. I get the feeling they were sawing blindfolded. Especially when you consider the fact that briefly in this movie, you have Norman Osborn, and he's played by one of his generation's more celebrated and respected actors who also plays a pretty damn good bad guy, Chris Cooper. That would have been an excellent choice to be the Goblin. You could still do the whole Harry and Peter storyline. That would be fine. But Harry feels like more of a nuisance than a serious evil mastermind throughout this entire thing. This is one time when they should have just shat or gotten off the pot when it came to doing this character. Because, yeah, he had a few good scenes with Peter. Credit where it's due. The blind squirrel managed to uncover a nut. Good for him. But as far as the rest of the movie, continuing that quickly with the genesis of Harry becoming the Goblin, it just distracted from what, as the defense pointed out, was a very strong arc riddled with some unsettling truths about mental illness as laid out by Jamie Foxx and Andrew Garfield. You had a chance there to do a tragic villain that I think with the right writing could have been on par with Thomas Hayden Church's portrayal of the Sandman. And instead, just like with that character, just like with that performance, you flushed it. You ruined it because you didn't know when to pull back and consider the notion that maybe less just might be more. Could have focused on that part, but you didn't. And instead, you tried to do two classic Spider-Man villains, and one ended up failing because you gave him short shrift due to trying to wedge in the Goblin story, and then you ultimately ended up with an execution of the origin of the Green Goblin, with the character being miscast, a poorly executed arc, and ultimately what I'm just going to flat out say is kind of an unsatisfying climax. Because I'll point out another thing. Part of the reason why it worked in the comics was because Harry and the Goblin were so well acquainted with each other at that point by the time Goblin dropped Gwen supposedly to her death. It meant so much because it was so personal, because the two had already done battle and matched wits enough times. It was seen as kind of an escalation. So I guess the way that I would look at it is doing it in this movie, especially the way it was done, is tantamount to, as opposed to in the comics, where you have a build-up that establishes Superman's acknowledgement of his own mortality before he goes to fight Doomsday, and acknowledging, one of these days, somebody's going to get me. I'm going to meet my match. And then lo and behold, that actually happens. And instead, in Batman v Superman, you just have, here you go. Here's Doomsday. In a world where Superman has been around for the equivalent of, he seemingly arrived yesterday. And you don't have that attachment to him, that dependence on him that's built up. You haven't gone anywhere with it. Again, the professional wrestling comparison. It's like if you have a feud that starts between two guys and you decide the very first match between them needs to be inside Hell in a Cell. Where do you go from there? What's your plan? What do you do? But again, what I keep coming back to is that for as much as this movie fails because of the things that it does poorly, it tries to do everything well and ultimately ends up not doing any of them quite as well as they should have. Again, I would certainly agree with you and disagree with Pat that when it comes to this movie, no, I think for this point in Peter Parker's life, Andrew Garfield was really letter perfect. In the first movie, I would have agreed with him. I would have agreed with the notion that I, too, was not a fan of cool guy, hipster, skateboarder Peter. That just kind of messes with the dynamic of who Spider-Man is, because he doesn't really ever come across as being that guy who feels insignificant or isn't that well liked. He's just seemingly an average, everybody's kind of okay toward him guy who then suddenly gets superpowers. Well, in this movie, it does indeed feel more like Peter Parker, the college years, and like he's kind of come into his own with these powers and accepted who he is, but he's still haunted by what he sees as the inevitable, idea of Gwen Stacy being put into the crosshairs. That part's done extremely well. I've got no problem with that. But it's just the simple notion of it feels like you could have taken half the plot threads in this movie and set them aside as their own movie after this one and given them the time and the development that they so richly deserved. That's ultimately the main crux of what I keep coming back to. Much of what the defense said about the movie, folks, to be honest with you, I agree with it. I agree by and large. It has the DNA of a better movie than it turned out being. It's just the problem is it also has the DNA of two better movies that could have been. This should have just been, in my opinion, Spider-Man versus Electro. And then at the end, some way or another, whether you decide to keep Norman Osborn or you decide to make Harry Osborn your Goblin, that is when, near the end, you start hinting that the next movie is going to point toward the rise of the Goblin and the genesis of the Sinister Six. Unfortunately, once more, Sony lacked that kind of patience. And what we got was just an utter, bloated, missed opportunity after missed opportunity after missed opportunity of a mess that did the franchise no services. And the nicest thing I can say about it is the fact that if this had not underperformed and come under such fire from fans as it did, well, we might have never gotten Spider-Man briefly drifting back over to the MCU, even though we know he's also eventually headed back Sony's way. The prosecution arrests.
So I had an idea. I thought you made a really good point as we conclude our discussion tonight. I thought you made a really good point about how they really should have had Chris Cooper as Norman Osborn. And I'm not saying he should have been the Goblin per se. I think maybe a better if they were going to do a Osborn subplot, I like the concept of Harry dying, or eventually die, like having a terminal illness. But I think Norman should have been alive, and Norman should have been the one to say, "Your friend, my son, is dying, Peter," or Spider-Man, or whatever. And, it would be the same series of events, but it's Norman who goes to Spider-Man and says, we need your blood to cure him. And then Spider-Man saying, look, we don't know what my blood will do to him. This is not safe. I refuse to participate in the name of all things ethical. And Norman, becoming rageful and saying, you're going to murder my son. You're going to kill him.
Yeah, also a great idea.
And that's what drives him to become the green. He goes into his armory and he puts the armor on and he says, "If you won't help my son, I'm gonna destroy your life." And let that sort of be the setup to the next movie.
I would have loved that. That would have been tremendous. It would have been visceral. It would have been something real. It would have been grounded. Especially since you could also play with that. And Marvel is, well, I'm not going to say they're always really good about this. I'll say that sometimes they're better at it than others. But I'll just say at their best, they're able to take a core emotion that's something that's incredibly difficult for anybody who hasn't been through it to grasp, and they channel that through a character or through several characters in such a way that the people who have been through it themselves are able to relate to it, and it's able to help people who haven't possibly experienced something go, so is it seriously anything like that? And, especially the last few years when, we've had a lot of stories, particularly with the state of race relations and law enforcement in this country, when we've seen seemingly one grieving parent after another on the news just at a loss for answers as to why their child is dead, and looking and just being desperate. Maybe not for revenge necessarily, but just for somebody to answer for their loss. You kind of had an opportunity where, yeah, like you said, if you'd gone with that notion of Harry's dying and Peter refuses to help when he possibly could have, and it just incenses Norman Osborn, well, with the right actor in that role, you could have somebody who maybe, for as over a top a premise as it might be with a superhero and a supervillain, who could have channeled a little bit of that into something.
See, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, into something that's as real as what we've seen a lot of times on a lot of the Marvel Netflix series, in terms of making sure to inject just that right ingredient of very real, understandable emotion.
What I would have done was I wouldn't have done Gwen Stacy dying in this movie. I would have saved it. And I actually think there was a way to do what Sony wanted to do, which was a Sinister Six movie, but it would have been The Amazing Spider-Man 3 Sinister Six. Because what I would have done was like I said, I would have had Harry die, and Chris Cooper as Norman Osborn at the funeral, telling Peter, who he doesn't know is Spider-Man yet, that as God is his witness, Spider-Man will die for this. I'm making it my purpose in life. I will walk away from Oscorp to make sure that Spider-Man and whoever he loves is destroyed. Mm-hmm. And really set up a sense of dread for the next movie. And I would have ended it, and I actually would have done that panning sequence of various Oscorp armors and weaponry, and Chris Cooper sort of turning to a henchman and saying, "Bring me 5 of the worst criminals you can. I'm going to need them." And that sets up the Sinister Six. And then over the course of the third movie, I would have Norman figure out that Peter Parker and Spider-Man are the same person, and then throws Gwen out the window. And then she died. And then you could do the exact same sequence again, with Peter not being able to save her, and her dying and everything else, and him, wanting to give up being Spider-Man. You can do that exact same ending, because I thought that ending was kind of pitch perfect. It just was in the wrong movie. Peter should have, like as you said, should have been focused on Electro, and then in the next movie, Peter's life is a living hell because he's got not 1, not 2, but in 6. It reduces some of Peter's best villains to kind of henchmen, but there's no reason to say that later on they can't break out of whatever the prison is in that world and go after Peter. Or someone can, or if you just want to make them henchmen for now, wearing the Doc Ock armor or whatever, and then later on, Octavius, whatever the hell his name is, finds the blueprints to the Dr. Octopus armor and then improves upon it. Like I said, you start with Norman and 5 other guys wearing various armors that resemble Spider-Man villains, and then once they're established, you can do whatever you want with them. You can either bring those characters back as even more menacing people in the future, or you can, do like I said with Dr. Octopus as an example, where the technology is introduced, but the person that really becomes that character comes along a little bit later. Either way, you've got your Sinister Six movie, which is what Sony was going after.
And to be honest, when it comes to the Goblin, I would have rather seen him get his own strict, just one-on-one movie with Spider-Man. You want to wedge Rhino in there. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, he's a classic mainstay rogue, and he's a former member of the Sinister Six. All well and good, but in terms of pure importance, not so much. But when it comes to Goblin, that should have been like the Amazing Spider-Man's The Dark Knight. That should have been the one where Spidey is truly taken to his limit. And maybe even kind of broken by the end of it. So that way, yeah, if you're going to go ahead and do 2 sequels after that, the way I see it, the smart way to go about it would have been, you had The Amazing Spider-Man. That introduced the Lizard. Okay, good on you. Good job with that. Amazing Spider-Man 2. Okay, you make that strictly as possible focused on just Spidey and Electro, and you maybe you introduce Harry at some point. You maybe have an interaction or two. You make him part of the Peter Parker more than the Spider-Man thread, but you don't make him a flat out villain. And you also make sure you introduce Norman Osborn. By the end of the movie, Harry's dead. Norman is crestfallen, or maybe you even just save that part for the next movie. Possibly, you could do it either way. But your third movie is Peter versus the Green Goblin, and Goblin takes him to places that he's never been. That's also where you do the death of Gwen Stacy. And then the fourth movie is finally Spider-Man versus the Sinister Six, which you've introduced in your own movie sometime between Spider-Man 3 and 4.
I get where your point is that, that the movie really, that you need to kind of draw a circle around Peter and Norman, but that's why I said I think you can do a Sinister Six movie where it's him and his henchmen, and it gives, you want to give Peter a lot of obstacles, especially if you're going for that epic Dark Knight feel. And granted, the Dark Knight only had 2 villains in it, but 3 if you count the Scarecrow. But the
Dark Knight. No, you shouldn't count the Scarecrow in that. The vast majority of the Dark Knight was Batman and Joker, and then in the third act, you've added Two-Face. So for most of the movie, it's mostly focused on Batman and Joker.
Mm-hmm. I mean, look, I don't think either one of us are wrong. It's just a matter of taste and ideas. And again, it's my idea. That's why I like it. But I like the idea of opening up the possibility of all of these villains coming back and back and back, because anybody can wear the technology or improve upon the technology. But I think, opening up I know part of the reason why Sony did what they did with the Green Goblin was they were afraid of repeating too much of what Sam Raimi had already done and done so well. So look, your main villain, your Joker, as it were, is the Green Goblin, is Norman Osborn. That part I agree with you 100%. But why can't he have henchmen? And why can't the henchmen have colorful, technological robotic suits that make them look like vultures and rhinos? And why can't one of them be Mysterio? Yeah, and I'm throwing that out there as never even getting away from what it was Sony wanted, which is why I pitched the idea the way that I did. I'm going along with what was in reality their wishes. So I don't want to. Whenever I make these sort of pitches for what might have been, I try to stay as close to what actually happened as possible. But I like the idea of Norman sort of recruiting the baddest of the bad around him and giving them all of this technology and saying, now go out there and just don't kill Spider-Man. We're going to save him for last, but go after Aunt May. Go after as many people in Peter's life as possible. Wreck his life. Make him want to kill himself. And when he's just at that point, that's when we lower the boom on him. It's the classic revenge villain story. And maybe I'm watching too much Arrow these days, but that was the plot of season 5. Was Prometheus wanting to...
But you got to admit, season 5 of Arrow was a drastic improvement over season 4.
Sure, no argument there.
In fact, I would even go so far as to say I think the 5th season was the best since season 2.
Yeah, it was really good. I enjoyed season 5. Yeah. I'm curious to see. Yeah. I am curious to see who lives and who dies on the island after they've done ballooned it up. But that point with bringing up.
I was going to go off on a little tangent about that, but go ahead, keep going with your actual salient points.
But that's why I brought it up was, Prometheus, Adrian Chase's whole thing was, I just don't want to kill you. What fun is that? What is the point of that? I want to show you that everybody in your life is miserable and worse off for having met you. And that's what they should have done with the Green Goblin. Spider-Man cost him his son, so now he will wreck every single part of Peter's life, including making him feel like the more people he has in his life, the worse he will make their lives.
Exactly.
I think that would have made for a strong narrative. And then when you get to the killing of Gwen Stacy, that becomes even much stronger because that's exactly the point that he's making. And I would flash back to Dennis Leary going, "You're going to get my daughter killed," and boom, she falls. All of it, and again, I would use that as shot in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I would have used the exact same footage of him, doing the second Twilight movie thing where the seasons change and he's just sitting in a chair moping. But that is the biggest crime with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, I think. Its single biggest sin is that there was an enormous amount of potential that was left on the table because Sony sort of lost sight of telling a tight story in favor of building a cinematic universe and catching up with Marvel. They really lost sight of the ball, and it showed, and then they got hacked, and then they ended up having to have Marvel make their movies for them, which, it's not where you want to be when you're a movie studio. But, we'll be here for another hour.
Here's a fair question. What are your thoughts on the notion that Sony, before they've even gotten Spider-Man proper back, are already kind of jumping ahead and going, well, let's get the ground rolling on this Venom movie?
It's kind of like my feelings on DC and Warner Brothers. I've been burned so many times, I don't have a lot of hope. So I hope Venom is good. I hope they don't screw it up, but it's hard for me to get excited about it. When I saw that they had announced that there was going to be a Venom movie next year, I went, ugh. I'm a little...
I guess what I'm asking, though, is what are your thoughts on the notion that as their means of rebooting their own Spider-Man franchise, they're doing Venom first as a means of leading up to that? I mean, that strikes me as possibly a little bit backwards.
Not necessarily. I mean, listen, if you're a good storyteller, you're a good storyteller. And it doesn't really matter which comes first, the chicken or the egg here. If they tell a good Venom story, they can absolutely insert Spider-Man in after. obviously early on, Venom was the yin to Spider-Man's yang, and they were closely tied together. And how could you couldn't possibly do one without the other. But Venom's grown into its own IP. You know, you have the entire saga of Eddie Brock and the alien symbiote, and at some point I think he became a different version of Venom. Then you have the Flash Thompson version of Venom, and you have Venom Space Knight. So why can't you tell some Venom stories until Spider-Man becomes available and then mix them up again? I mean, you would have to probably stray somewhat from the original arc of Eddie Brock becoming Venom because he wants to murderize Peter Parker. But again, it's all in how you tell the story. And I could sit here for another hour, spelling out a series of Venom movies that lead to a confrontation with Spider-Man down the line once he's finished up his 5-movie contractual obligations from Marvel. But that's, like I said, if you're a good storyteller, you'll figure it out. If you're a shitty storyteller, you'll create the Suicide Squad movie.
Well, and when it comes to that one, I question how much of that belongs on David Ayer's shoulders and how much of that is Warner Brothers interfering in what it might have actually been a decent movie.
We'll never know because they mucked up the soup so much.
Oh, please let Justice League be good.
Oh, God, I don't want to talk about it. All right, with that said, I believe we have said all that needs to be said for now about The Amazing Spider-Man 2. With this caveat, because I did forget to mention this before, I give Sony credit for really trying to create a new and interesting identity for this series of Spider-Man movies. In no other iteration were the parents such a large part of his character and his motivations and the storytelling. And Sony tried so hard to make his parents a big part of it. And not all of it works. Some of it's okay. But at least they tried. Because not even in the comic book do I remember him having any sort of real big issues with. I mean, his parents are sort of a non-entity. It was just he was raised by Aunt May. That's all you needed to know. I mean, Uncle Ben is the crux of the matter. His parents may as well have not existed. He might as well have been a virgin birth. But I mean, I'm not saying it was all the way handled well. I liked the idea of the parents having their own sort of backstory that informs life that Peter is living now. So, good on Sony for trying to create a new identity for this series of Spider-Man movies, even if it didn't work as well as it could have. That being said, I believe we have closed the book here on The Amazing Spider-Man 2 sufficiently. I feel like we both got out what we needed to say on it, and I don't need to readdress the subject again. Which, and my God, if it was ever a tagline for On Trial, it's On Trial, where I say everything I need to say about a movie and never have to talk about it again. With that being said, next week is all Planet of the Apes all the time. On source material, we're going to cover a book called Tarzan on the Planet of the Apes, which was a 5-issue limited series brought to you by Boom Studios and Dark Horse. Robert Winfrey and I will review War for the Planet of the Apes on Damn You Hollywood. Metal Hammer of Doom is reviewing Dying Fetus. Wrong one to fuck with. That ain't got nothing to do with Crazy Apes. It's just what we're doing. And then Sean and I are going to be back again, and Sean has to do the heavy lifting of trying to defend the Tim Burton Planet of the Apes. Good luck, my friend.
Oh my
Good
God. luck. I'm so glad that I have a little less than a week to figure this out, because that is so out of left field and so bizarre and so misguided, even by Tim Burton standards. I don't know what to say to justify its existence. And I mean, and to be clear, I feel like this gets misunderstood sometimes. I don't mean if you for some reason like Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes that I'm criticizing you. I just mean who had an idea of Planet of the Apes in their mind when they handed it over to Tim Burton, and then that was what they got back, and then they just thought, yeah, we'll release that. We'll ask people to give us money to see this. Like, how do you go ahead with a movie with that many problems? How do you, I mean, seemingly better movies have just been kind of shit-canned forever for, less reasons. But this somehow made it into theaters. People were charged money. People paid money. This somehow got a home video release. This exists, and I don't know why.
Well, we're going to talk about it next week, and fun will be had by all.
Damn you, Hollywood, and fuck you, Tim Burton.
I have a funny feeling, I'm going to lay out all these terrible things about this movie, and Sean's just going to go. In defense of Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes, it seems to have been shot well, as in they weren't doing it on a GoPro. Good night, everybody.
You may not be all that far off. I'm not going to outright say that you're definitely wrong, but that's occurred to me.
Right. This past week was Spider-Man week. This show is 2 days late. I went out to dinner with my parents. Don't know how to read a damn clock is the issue, and they didn't come home from the amusement park with my kids until it was too late, and then we needed to go to dinner. So just one thing ran into another, and we decided to do the show tonight, where I wasn't going to be under a gun. But you can go back in the archives. I believe also put up today was source material. We opted to not do a source material on Spider-Man and the Vulture. It just didn't happen for us. However, we got an even better show as Jesse Starcher and Benjamin J. Colon discuss Kraven's Last Hunt. So go ahead and check that out. Also in the archives is a review of Spider-Man Homecoming, a glowing review for the most part. And the Metal Hammer of Doom discussed the latest rap metal project from members of Cypress Hill, Biohazard, Fear Factory, Worst, and what was the other one? Maybe that was it. Power Flow, and their debut album, Power Flow. So that's what's all in the archives and what we all got going on next week. Sean, do you want to plug anything? You got anything in the works?
Not quite yet. My priorities are kind of still elsewhere personally, so I'm not doing much blogging these days. If you want to hit me up to talk about anime, Arizona Coyotes hockey, wrestling, music, Mass Effect, whatever I happen to be jabbering on about, you can find me on Twitter at Comer Codex. So hit me up there. When I get tweets at me, I tend to reply to them. So usually right away. So if you want to ping me with any love, hate, respectful disagreements, go ahead and drop me a line there. But otherwise, my usual spiel. Thank you, everybody who listens live, who downloads, who loves the show and tells a friend, who hates the show and tells somebody they hate. You are all the reason why we do what we do. We love to entertain. We love to inform. We thank you for welcoming us into your ear holes a few times a week. Thank you to, I never say this enough, thank you to Jesse Starcher for that absolutely outstanding, that fucking awesome voiceover. I love that. And I love that he didn't so much ask permission as he just went ahead and did it. And he's like, here you go. You're a good man, Jesse Starcher. Thank you to the inimitable Benjamin J. Colon, our East Coast friend up in the Big Apple, who has educated me so very thoroughly on the world of comics over the years, especially when it comes to Spider-Man. Long-time, great friend of ours. You know, bless your heart, buddy. Thank you for bringing so much color to our shows. And last but not least, I am simply going to say, never dull your colors for someone else's canvas.
All right, we'll see you next Thursday at 9 o'clock in Eastern Standard Time. Court is now in recess. All rise. We will see you next week. Be well, be safe, and behave.